In the summer of 2015, Europe experienced the largest influx of refugees since World War II. The refugee crisis has seen thousands of displaced peoples dangerously attempting to reach Europe through difficult and hazardous journeys across sea and land. Principally due to the Syrian civil war which erupted in 2014, the refugee crisis in 2015 is one of the largest humanitarian crises of the early 21st century. This study will assess one of the relief effort for the crisis by examining the effort of the United Nations and the World Food Program. Specifically, the World Food Program's Emergency Food Aid Program is scrutinized to assess whether these programs mitigate the problems of food insecurity that displaced Syrians have been experiencing in a dignified and humanitarian manner. In fact, the World Food Program does an excellent and noble job in distributing assistance to newly displaced people. However, due to the nature of food aid, displaced Syrians and refugees are not granted the autonomy that they deserve, autonomy that can help to reinforce the sense of self-worth, self-sufficiency, and dignity that is critical to a refugee's well-being. Distribution of food aid is necessary for the initial needs of newly displaced people. Through analyzing reports from the United Nations and the World Food Program, and ethnographies of Syrian refugees dependent on food aid in refugee camps, this study attempts to argue that as displaced Syrians become more settled, the current method of distributing food aid must be reformed in a way that autonomy is reintroduced to the displaced people. For the food program to be effective, emergency food transfers must be given to those in the initial stages of displacement, whereafter refugees must be given the autonomy over their basic needs through credit they can use to purchase their own food and basic needs or through other possible means. To begin, let's talk about food security in Syria. The UN and WFP were not prepared for a refugee crisis on this scale. Consequently, refugee camps are undersupplied and overly populated, subjecting people to illness and hunger. According to the WFP's most recent report on food security in Syria, the level of food insecurity has progressively deteriorated since the start of the conflict. Food prices have been steadily rising across the country, inflation has been increasing, and salaries have remained stagnant. These factors played major roles in the aggravation of the already weak purchasing power of the most vulnerable people, who find it increasingly difficult to meet their basic food needs. In January 2017, 13.5 million Syrians were in need of humanitarian assistance, 6.3 million were internally displaced, and 9 million were in need of food assistance. A year later, 13.1 million Syrians were in need of humanitarian assistance, 6.1 million were internally displaced, and 10.5 million were in need of food assistance. Within a year, displaced Syrians experienced more improvement in their situations. However, it is interesting to point out that in spite of these improvements, there was a tremendous increase of 1.5 million people in need of food assistance. This could be attributed to the continuing conflict within Syria that continued to destroy infrastructure that allow for food markets to function and hindered the reintegration of a self-sufficient Syrian population. Food aid and the World Food Program. On the World Food Program's website, the organization publicizes that it provides food aid in Syria through multiple means, such as providing food rations to displaced Syrians, distributing electronic vouchers to Syrian refugees in vulnerable host communities, and supporting the rehabilitation of bakeries and local food producers. In other countries, activities include livelihood programs in Lebanon and training opportunities in Jordan. WFP also proudly supports the education of Syrian children by providing nutritious snacks in almost 900 schools across Syria. WFP fights malnutrition by providing nutrition support to young children, pregnant women, and nursing mothers. However, if one scrutinizes the WFP's public data from their food programs, it is evident that even if the WFP does act on all of these publicly stated initiatives, some initiatives get a majority of the aid while others are only given minuscule funding. Of all the food aid distributed in Syria, 89% are given in the form of food transfers, wherein the displaced Syrians line up to receive rations or other forms of food from humanitarian workers. Only 5% are given in the form of school meal programs, and 1% is given in the form of cash-based transfer in the form of food vouchers. Most of the food aid that displaced Syrians receive does allow them their autonomous freedom to purchase and consume their own food of choice. Displaced Syrians or refugees lose their sense of self-worth, self-sufficiency, and dignity because of how food aid is structured and distributed. The right to food. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Food and Agricultural Organization advocate against the common misconceptions about the right to food. The right to food is not the same as the right to be fed. Others assume that the right to food means that officials in government and international institutions have to hand out free food to anyone who needs it. In the context of food aid, the right to food is not fully met in the mere handing out of food rations. Recently, displaced Syrians benefit a lot from this kind of food transfers, but as they become more settled in their community, they grow dependent on these kinds of food transfers and lose their sense of self-sufficiency and autonomy. Being forced to eat the same ready-to-eat rations of bread, fava beans, hummus, and canned chicken provided by humanitarian workers dehumanizes these displaced individuals, especially after they have settled in the refugee camps and informal communities. The dignities of these displaced people are not respected when their autonomy is not seen as a priority. As told by the Syrian refugees, possibly due to the difficulties in performing academic studies in conflict-ridden Syria and the ethical issues of subjecting displaced peoples to studies, there are no existing ethnography specifically regarding the experiences of displaced Syrians with food aid. However, there is merit in looking at related studies that could be translated to the issues in Syria. A study by Robin van der Voort, a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Antwerp, looks at how eating practices of Syrian refugees in Belgium fulfill a central role in expressing collective identities. Specifically, the author looks into the power play between those giving food and those receiving, the sense of individual autonomy and the dignity fostered by certain refugees, and the revitalization of collective selves. There are three takeaways from this study that could be applied to how one should think of distributing aid to displaced Syrians. The first is that the regular act of distributing food transfers to displaced Syrians relegates aid recipients to subordinate positions. The second takeaway is that the fact that refugees in Belgium are able to purchase their own food in markets and groceries allows them to foster a sense of individual autonomy and dignity. And lastly, the final takeaway is that the empowerment of refugees through providing them with purchasing capabilities revitalizes their collective selves, and that they are integrated back in their community and are able to collaborate and interact with other members of society. Ultimately, food aid programs in Syria should not only provide the necessary sustenance and nutrition to those in need of food in crisis areas, but also empower displaced Syrians and refugees in order for them to smoothly integrate themselves back into society. To recapitulate the main points of this study, the food aid programs of the WFP play a major role in the assistance of displaced Syrians and refugees. The WFP does have a variety of food programs that provide necessary emergency food relief for those in crisis areas and allow some sort of autonomy to certain displaced Syrians through food voucher programs. However, a large majority of the food aid programs is merely focused on food transfers, the act of distributing food rations to those in need. Moreover, food voucher programs consist of only 1% of the total food aid done in Syria, are limited to only pregnant and nursing women. The current operational structure of the WFP's food aid in Syria inhibits the integration of displaced people into society. Their autonomies, dignities, and capacities to be self-sufficient are undermined. The lack of empowerment in the current food aid program structure in Syria not only makes it more difficult for displaced Syrians and refugees to integrate themselves back into society, but also ignores their rights and dignities as human beings. Moving forward, the WFP should structure their initiatives in a way that prioritizes not only the nutritional and health aspects of food, but also the empowerment and reintegration of displaced individuals into society.